When we think of inviting hummingbirds to our gardens, the first thing, and sometimes the only thing that comes to mind, is to get a feeder. So, is there some scientific evidence about the benefit of these feeders? Or do we know if they're safe? Are they good or bad for the birds? Also, what do we know about the natural diet of a hummingbird? What exactly is the difference between flower nectar and the sugar solution? These are some of the things I'm reviewing today. Welcome to Garden and Nature Southwest. I am Vani Shukla. In today's episode, I'll review the best practices to feed hummingbirds in our gardens based on the scientific studies and facts that are available to us so far. So, when I first wanted to attract hummingbirds to my garden, of course, the first thing I also thought about was to get a feeder. So, I went to the store to get a feeder, and next to it, I found the packet of that solution mix. So, I got both things, and at home, I prepared the red solution, filled the feeder, and pretty soon after hanging the feeder, the hummingbirds were there. This was like an instant reward. We were not expecting that. We thought it would be a day or two before the hummingbirds will discover the feeder. But they were there pretty quickly. And for the next 2 days, we were pretty much glued to our windows, enjoying watching those hummingbirds whenever we were home. Now, this was around the time when I was beginning to learn about our modern food system and so many artificial ingredients that are present in our processed food. And I think it was along the same thought process that I wondered what was in that solution mix. So I went to check the packet and found, of course, the red coloring 40, sodium benzoate, and some other ingredients. And it was pretty clear to me that these ingredients are not part of natural hummingbird diet. So there's no need for these ingredients to be present in the sugar solution. So I threw out the solution, emptied the feeder, and a bit disappointed, I started to look for safer ways to feed the hummingbirds. Now, back then on the internet, there wasn't so much information available about hummingbird foods, the natural diet, or scientific studies on the feeder solution. I could not even find for the homemade solution that 1:4 ratio. What's the reason behind that particular ratio? So, because my doubts weren't answered, I thought, well, the safest way will be to just go with planting hummingbird flowers. And so that's what I did for next several years. So of course, when I first started to grow the plants, the result was not in an instant as it was with the hummingbird feeder, because it took a few weeks for the plants to get established and the flowers to bloom. But after that, hummingbirds were there all the time because I kept adding and growing more plants, and something was blooming all year round. And it was so wonderful to have hummingbirds in the garden all the time except for 2 or 3 months in the wintertime. We were pretty happy with that, but a few years ago I got curious again to see if there was any new evidence on hummingbird diet, on feeder solution, etc. So I looked up on internet, and of course now we have so much more information available than 15 or 16 years ago. Among some of the interesting studies that I found, the first one that I would like to mention was a paper published in 2019 by researchers in University of California, Davis. These researchers looked for microorganisms present on the hummingbird feeders and also the flower nectar and the hummingbirds. They were also wanting to know if there were any pathogenic or disease-causing microorganisms present in the sugar solution. So good thing they found that most of the microorganisms, which are the bacteria and the fungi, they did not check for viruses. So the bacteria and fungi present in the sugar solution, most of them were not disease-causing. Only a very small minority were pathogenic. So that was one finding. Now, another interesting thing that they found was that the species of microorganisms present in the sugar solutions were quite different from those found in the flower nectar and on the hummingbirds. Now, what's the significance of this finding? Well, first of all, as we know, in general, microorganisms are essential parts of our health of any animal. We know so much about human microbiome, the microorganisms that live inside us and on us. They play such a big role in our overall health. Also, they determine what kind of disease risk we're going to have, even turning on and off our genes. There's so many functions of our body that are dependent on these microorganisms. There's such a good harmony between the cells of our body and our microbiome. And same is true for pretty much all life on Earth, including the hummingbirds. The microbiome of a hummingbird is essential to its health, to what kind of diseases it's going to get. Now, so far, there's not much information available to tell us what kind of microorganisms are associated with what kind of risks in hummingbirds. We may not have all that data, but it's still important to note that the microbes present in the sugar solution are different from what's present in the flower nectar, and it might have a potential effect on the hummingbirds. Good or bad, we do not know, but it may have that effect, because the scientists also found that the microbes present in the hummingbird are affected by the foods they eat. Now, another interesting article that I found was published in 2022, and this was about the composition of flower nectar, the nutrients that are present in the flower nectar. This particular article was not comparing hummingbird feeders to the flower nectar. This was only about what's present in the flower nectar. And I found it interesting because even though intuitively we know that yes, there's going to be difference between the sugar solution in the feeders and the naturally occurring flower nectar, yes, sure, there's a difference. But when we actually spell it out, when we actually look at the details, it just emphasizes to us that a sugar solution is way different from flower nectar. So the biggest difference that caught my attention was that the sugar solution is more static, stagnant. It does not change. Yes, there might be a slight amount of change in the concentration of sugar if there's fermentation going on. Slight variation may happen after a couple of days. But when you look at the flower nectar, it's a very dynamic, ongoing, changing kind of a fluid. The nectar glands in the flower are constantly secreting or reabsorbing the flower nectar. And those kind of changes depend on so many different things. Depends on how many pollinators are visiting, butterflies and other insects, and hummingbirds. So depending on that, the flower changes its concentration of the sugars and different nutrients. If it's early morning or if it's late in the evening, the concentrations are different. Also, how's the temperature, weather, season, and of course the most important thing, what kind of flower species you're looking at. So there's so many variations. Even in one individual flower, it's constantly changing. Now let's look at the individual nutrients. Sugar, the most important thing, that's what we put in the sugar solution. We put sucrose. That's the sugar for the most part in the flower nectar as well. However, in our feeder solution, the table sugar that we put, it has one molecule of glucose, one molecule of fructose. That's what makes the compound molecule of sucrose. In the flower nectar also, of course, sucrose is sucrose, so it's one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. But there are some enzymes secreted and there are some microbes present that can act on the glucose or the fructose one more than the other. And so that ratio may vary. It may not always be 1-to-1. It may be secreted as 1-to-1 as sucrose, but that may change. And that may have a different nutritional effect on the hummingbird, possibly. Also, in the flower nectar, it's not only sucrose, but a flower may also have maltose or xylose. So other kinds of sugars might be present, although they're in very small concentrations. It also depends on the species of the plant. Now, other thing that we often don't think about when we think of flower nectar is that nectar is not just sugar. The flower nectar also has amino acids, it has antioxidants like flavonoids and phenols, it has fatty acids, it has so many other compounds. It also has some proteins for antimicrobial activity to reduce the disease-causing bacteria, to reduce other pathogens. So flower nectar is a lot more than just a sugar solution. Again, it's important to note these differences between the flower nectar and the sugar solution so that we are aware that what we are feeding the hummingbirds in the feeder is not a full meal. Also, important thing to note is the hummingbird's full diet is not just flower nectar. Insects are a big part of a hummingbird diet. So again, we need to be aware of that when we are putting out the feeders, we are not providing the hummingbirds a complete meal. But when we have plants, even more when we have native plants, then not only they will get flower nectar, but also insects that are attracted to those plants. The hummingbird will eat those insects as well. So they will have more chance of having a complete meal when there are more and more flowering plants around. Now, I would like to mention another study that I came across, and this study found some benefits. This was published in 2017, and they studied Anna's hummingbird. So we're talking about just one species of hummingbird, and we do not know if this will apply to all species of hummingbirds or not, but at least we have study on one hummingbird. In this study, they found that Anna's hummingbirds are now found to be overwintering in some of the northern areas where they were not found before in the wintertime. Now, according to the study, the couple of things that might be contributing to that would be the rise in the global temperatures and the winter temperatures. So winters are warmer in some of the northern areas, and Anna's hummingbird stick around for the winter in these areas. Other contributing factor they found was the hummingbird feeders. Because the feeders are around in the urban areas, these hummingbirds are getting some supplement food during the winter time, which may be a big contributor as well. So again, the bottom line about feeders, yes, there are some concerns, but there might also be some benefits. Now, how do we incorporate this information and put it into practice in our gardens? How can this information help us to do the best for the hummingbirds? So first important thing, if one chooses to have feeders in the garden, then they have to be well maintained. And this was also mentioned by the researchers from UC Davis. They recommended cleaning the feeders every 12 to 24 hours in the warmer areas, and in the cooler areas, 48 to 72 hours. Because if the solution sits around longer, there might be more chances for the pathogenic bacteria. The feeders on which the study was done were regularly cleaned, emptied out, refilled, and that's when they found that only a minority were pathogenic organisms. That minority of pathogenic bacteria may become quite big in number if the feeders are left for several days without being cleaned and refilled. Another thing we can learn from this data is the sugar solution is not a complete diet. It's calories, but without any other nutrients. So it may be a supplement, but if you plant a lot of native plants, then apart from the extra calories in the sugar solution and the feeders, hummingbirds have a choice of going to the flowers and getting their full meals. They will be visiting the plants and getting the insects also. Also, another thing about the sugar solution, and this is something that pretty much all scientists are on the same page, that there's no need to add any kind of red coloring or dyes to the sugar solution. Now, I was curious and I looked up what kind of ready-to-use sugar solutions are available in the market. And unfortunately, a lot of these products advertise in such a way that can be confusing to us if we are not paying attention. For example, it might say in bold letters, no artificial colors or dyes. Automatically, our mind jumps to, oh, it's natural. But all they're talking about is no artificial color or dye. They're not saying nothing artificial there. I looked at the ingredients in these, and of course, there's still sodium benzoate, potassium sorbate, sodium bicarbonate, all those things added. One thing I want to mention is that sometimes you may come across an ingredient that may sound like natural. Sodium bicarbonate, okay, it's just it's baking soda. You might think baking soda is harmless, but we have to know that baking soda is harmless to us, but we have no idea how it's going to affect the hummingbirds. And the same thing with some of the other ingredients that may be good for us, but not necessarily for the hummingbirds. And actually, we don't have information if it's good or bad for hummingbirds. For example, brown sugar. Sure, it might be better for us compared to the processed white sugar, but the additional nutrients and minerals that are good for us may be harmful for the hummingbirds because our physiology is very different from the hummingbird physiology. So we should stick to the recommendations based on these science facts that the processed white sugar that has no minerals, no other nutrients, that is the safest way to go because we do not know what concentrations of other minerals are going to be safe for the hummingbirds. So as far as 1:4 ratio, what's the rationale behind that? Well, in the flower nectar, the concentration is somewhere around 1:4. However, as I mentioned before, it's not a static solution. The concentration may vary in the flower nectar. And again, depending on so many factors, it may vary from 1:3 to 1:5. We cannot make the best judgment on what's needed by what hummingbird and in what temperature. There's so much fine-tuning that goes on in the flower nectar, and we cannot exactly imitate that. And that's why I think the scientists recommend the safest ratio, 1:4, something in the middle, less likely to cause harm, and at the same time will provide the needed calories for the birds. Another question that might come to your mind is whether to use tap water or boiled water. In the UC Davis study, they used bottled water. The Smithsonian National Zoo website mentions we can use tap water in United States because we know that tap water is mostly safe. We don't have any pathogens in our tap water. However, the Audubon Society website recommends to use boiled water. So boil it, cool it, and then make the right proportion solution. And I think it's even more important for places that may not have safe drinking water. Especially in the South American countries, there might be a lot of places where the tap water is not safe to drink. So I think best practices there would be to use boiled water. And even in US, if you don't mind boiling the water before use, you're not doing any harm. You're just taking that extra step. So in my garden, for many years, I've had so many hummingbird plants, many different species, and we've enjoyed hummingbirds all year round. But in the last couple of years, since reviewing these studies, I have started to use hummingbird feeders occasionally, just for a few days a year. There were questions about whether it would affect the migration of the birds or not. We don't have enough data. Hopefully in future we will continue to have more and more scientific information about the behavior of these birds, about their health, about their diet and nutrition. But for now, when I use the hummingbird feeders occasionally as a supplement, I see the hummingbirds are using both at the same time. They go to the flowers and they go to the feeders too. It's not that when I put the feeder out, they stop feeding from the plants. I see them catching tiny little mites and spiders from the walls. One of the good things that I find about the plants is that you don't have to worry about emptying or cleaning or any of that. And as far as being able to watch the birds up close, that is possible with plants too. That's what I do around my patio. I have a number of penstemons and salvias and a scanthus bush very close to my patio. So we are watching these birds drinking from these flowers just from about 5 to 10 feet distance. You just have to be careful. If you have a pet, then you don't want to do that. Same thing with the feeder. You don't want to put a feeder close to the seating area if you have pets, especially cats. So to recap, this scientific information available to us prompts us to think about the differences between the overall natural hummingbird diet and the sugar solution. The sugar solution may be used as a supplement, but it is not a full meal when we look at all the nutrients provided by the flower nectar and the insects. So if we can incorporate a lot of plants, especially native plants also, then we are providing a full, healthy, natural diet to a hummingbird. And then we can choose or not choose to have hummingbird feeders also every now and then. If one chooses hummingbird feeders, then the maintenance and other proper care measures of the feeder and the solution are very, very important for the health of the birds. I'll share some information in future episodes about different plants you can use in your garden design to help the hummingbirds, both for flower nectar as well as their habitat. So for now, I will end it here. Until next time, thank you for listening.